All right, guys, welcome back to chapter 11. Today we're going to dive into email forensics. Now, our core objective for this module is going to be, well, we got to master that header analysis. We need to trace some origins of emails and investigate client stores. And is it a phishing attack? I don't know. Let's find out. All right, we're going to expect some heavy scenario-based questions on the exam, okay? They love to test you on the exam for email investigations. You must understand both the network flow of email and where the forensic artifacts physically reside on a suspect's hard drive. So, our learning objectives are going to be broken down into three areas. First, we're going to cover architecture. We need to understand the roles of MUA, MTA, MDA, and, well, how each of these are going to be used to help cover things like headers, how we're going to know how to trace a sender's IP address and detect even spoofing. Finally, we're going to be looking at artifacts. We're going to investigate client-side storage like Outlook PSTs or OSTs and generic EML files. Now we need to memorize the acronyms of MUA, MTA, MDA for the exam. And instead, the exam will frequently use these instead of saying email client or email server. So you need to understand the terminology. And we'll go through that through this chapter. So let's define the three pillars of how emails work. The first one is going to be the MUA, otherwise known as the Mail User Agent. This is the email itself. This is like the client, okay? Think of Outlook or Thunderbird, and this is where the user is going to write and view email. Then we've got the MTA, the Mail Transfer Agent. Think of this like the post office. These are the servers that are going to route the mail across the internet, like SendMail, Postfix, or even Microsoft Exchange. Then we have the MDA, otherwise known as the Mail Delivery Agent. Now, the Mail Delivery Agent is going to be responsible for delivering the final mail to the user's inbox, like Dovecoat. So, know that evidence can be collected at every single one of these pillars. If a user deletes an email from the MUA, otherwise their client, it may still exist in the MTA logs, or even in the MDA storage server. So we need to understand that any of these could be looked at to get evidence for our case, for our investigation. Now, when sending email, we use SMTP, otherwise known as Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. It traditionally is going to operate on port 25. Now, that's the unencrypted legacy mode. Now, port 587, on the other hand, is normally used in secure transmissions. This is where it's encrypted. It is used to send mail from the client to the server, as well as, different servers. From a forensic standpoint, the SMTP log on the server is absolutely critical for proving who sent an email and exactly when they sent it. For the exam, make sure that you remember these ports 25 and 587, and ensure that you associate SMTP strictly with sending or transferring mail, not receiving it. Sending or transferring mail only. For receiving email, we normally have two primary protocols. We have POP3 and IMAP. Now, POP3 is going to follow the download and delete model. It downloads the email to the local device and then removes it from the server, meaning that the evidence exists primarily on the client device. IMAP, on the other hand, is a sync and store model. It keeps the email on the server while caching it locally, meaning the evidence should exist on both server and client. And this is a guaranteed exam topic. You must know that POP3 environment dictates that the investigator must use the local user's hard drive to recover email, as the server will likely be empty. Now, talk about structure of an email. Every email file typically is denoted as a .eml. And this has two main parts separated with a blank line. The top of the file is going to be called the header. This is the metadata. It contains routing information, the sender's IP information, timestamps, and even spam scores. This is the most critical part for our forensics analysis because it's going to prove where it came from and whether or not it's legit or not. The bottom is going to be the body. This is the content containing the actual text, HTML, and any attachments. They're usually going to be base 64 encoded, so you may have to decode it. Now be aware that attachments sent via emails are typically also going to be encoded in base 64. But this is going to allow binary files like pictures or PDFs to traverse text-based SMTP networks without having any issues of corruption. Now the first part is the header. So email headers are essentially the digital fingerprints, but they must be read correctly. You read the headers from top to bottom. Stop that, reverse it. You read the headers from bottom to top if you want chronological order. Our main goal during an investigation is to trace the path back to the origin, which means we need to find the first received header to identify the original IP address of the sender. The bottom to top rule is paramount. The exam will give you raw email headers and ask you to identify the original sender's IP. Always look for the lowest receive line in the header block. Let's talk about the chain of custody when it comes to email. Now, the chain of custody has 3 different packets. Every MTA, the transfer, will have the email will have a receive stamp. So if there's multiple servers that this email has gone through, you'll have a receive stamp at the top of each header. So the bottom one is going to be the sender's MTA, or the personal PC. The middle consists of normally relay servers and spam filters, and there could be multiple here. And then top is going to be the recipient's MDA. Now, however, I have to give you a warning. Headers can be forged. You can only fully trust the headers added by servers that you control, which normally are going to be at the very top if you're doing an investigation of trying to trace back where the spam message came from. So we need to understand the header forgery, that an attacker can use Telnet or a script to inject a fake receive line into an email before it hits the first legitimate MTA, effectively going to bury their real IP address further up the chain. So we may have to look further into this to see whether or not it works or not. Now, a lot of spam protection is going to protect us from this type of injection, but it still happens as of today to see, hey, is the sender of this email actually been validated through different services like the SDF or the DMARC protocols. Now, once you finally have successfully extracted the IP from the bottom, most trusted received header, what do you do with it? Well, you can do a couple things with that IP address. For one, you can take it and see the geolocation. So you're going to map the IP to a physical city or country to try to see where did it come from. Now, you do need to note that VPNs can obscure this, so we may not be able to use this feature if it came from a VPN source. We can also take the IP address and do a whois lookup to identify the ISP or the organization that owns that IP range. So if this came from commodity ISPs, like your home network, we can determine, did this come from a Comcast PC or not, to help us give an idea of who do we contact to figure out who owns this IP address. So we may need to get a subpoena or a warrant to be able to pursue this further with that ISP. Last, we can also do a blacklist check against databases like Spamhaus or Barracuda to see if the IP is already known for sending spam or malware. My favorite place for this is actually the MX Toolkit, but there's many ways to actually look up a blacklist check. For the exam, make sure you familiarize yourself with the different tools like Whois and basic OSINT techniques. Investigators will use these immediately to determine if the IP belongs to a residential IP, indicating maybe a compromised home PC, or even a bulletproof hosting provider. Now, email spoofing itself. Let's talk about spoofing. Simply put, the from field is normally a lie. SMTP does not authenticate the from address by default, meaning anyone can send an email claiming to be the president at whitehouse.gov. So to combat this, we'll look at 3 detection protocols. The first one is going to be the SPF, otherwise known as the Sender Policy Framework. This is a DNS record that lists the valid IPs allowed to send mail on that domain. So if I get an email from whitehouse.gov, I will query its DNS to say, hey, what SPF do you have? Did I get this email from a valid whitehouse.gov email server or not? If I didn't, then it's normally marked as spoofing or spam or even completely blocked. The other way we could do it is through DKIM, which is Domain Keys Identified Mail. And this is the cryptographic signature to ensure that the email integrity wasn't tampered with. Think of this as the digital signature that we utilize on this. And remember, digital signatures are normally going to be used with public and private key infrastructure. And so they'll probably stamp it with a private key. We'll use their public key to determine if it truly was coming from them. And then we'll use hashing algorithms, hopefully like SHA-1 or SHA-256, something higher than MD5, to identify whether or not this mail has been tampered with. And then lastly, we'll have DMARC. Now, DMARC is the overarching policy that tells the receiving server what to do if FPF or DKIM checks fail. So if they fail, do we just delete the mail? Do we send it to spam? Do we put a big warning label at the top saying we couldn't validate this? What do we do with that email? Now, there are some other ways of doing it. So there's a lot of ways of doing phishing. So BEC itself, business email compromise, we'll have to be able to detect this. So in a BEC attack, criminals will try to impersonate things like executives to fraudulently try to authorize like wire transfers or do things that are known in social engineering attacks, right? We'll use urgency or authoritative figures to try to figure out what's going on. Now, when we analyze, we're going to look for specific forensic signs. The first one we're going to look for is a reply to mismatch. The email says it's from the CEO, but hidden in the reply to fields, it routes it back to hacker@gmail.com. That's one mismatch that would say, well, maybe this is a fake email. Another thing might be typo squatting. And what typo squatting is they're going to register a domain that looks identical to the real one. Like instead of company.com, it's going to be cornpany.com. Instead of an M, it's going to be an R and an N next to each other. Because the R and an N next to each other looks like an M, but it's not. So it's a different domain itself because it's easy to misinterpret it as the correct domain. And then lastly, it might have something like urgency. The text always creates artificial panic, such as pay this immediately or some kind of urgency involved with that. Now for the exam, remember that typo squatting and reply to mismatches are going to be your primary technical indicators. If you look at that and we see that, we're probably going to be saying, hey, those are fake emails. Whether or not we're dealing with a wire fraud case or whatever investigation we're working through. So we're always going to check things like the raw headers, as the standard Outlook GUI will hide the reply to address from the victim. And so if we look at it that way, normally we can find things a little deeper. So moving to the client side, we're going to look at Microsoft Outlook. And Microsoft Outlook has a couple different data files that it likes to store. The first one's going to be the PST file, Personal Storage Table. These are the archives. They contain email, calendars, and conflicts, and are highly portable between computers. A lot of people will use PSTs as an archive so they can save some storage space on the server. So a lot of companies that won't let you store as many data on the server, so they'll save it off to a PST on their local PC. There's going to be an OST, so if you have offline mode turned on Outlook, you'll have a cache file on your computer called an OST. This is going to be a copy of the Exchange server mailbox. Now, it's securely tied to the specific hardware in the user profile, so if you try to move the OST, normally it's not readable. And then lastly is going to be the recovery feature. Deleted emails inside of PSTs are not wiped instantly. They're just simply marked as deleted and often can be fully recovered. Just because they deleted it from Outlook doesn't mean it's gone. So for the exam, you need to know the difference between a PST and an OST. And know that OST files are encrypted and bound to the local MAPI profile. In other words, the lone MAPI profile is the hardware and the user account direct to it. Now, it's going to be much harder to analyze an OST offline on a forensic workstation without the user's Active Directory credentials. So if you have the credentials, normally we can open up the OST file even on a forensics image. Now, outside of Outlook, you're going to encounter some other formats. The first one is probably going to be the inbox. Inbox is used by Thunderbird and Apple Mail. It structures data by storing all emails for a specific folder inside of a single long text file. Sounds horrible. The other formats are going to be EML. This is a very generic email format. It saves each individual email as a separate, simple text file. And lastly is going to be the EDB, which is normally a Microsoft Exchange server one. And this is a massive central database for an entire organization's email. So every user's email will probably be in the EDB. It's huge. Okay. Now, for the exam, make sure that you know which client uses which format, because identifying that a suspect uses Thunderbird should immediately tell you to start searching their drive for inbox files. And this is how the questions will be on the exam. If the client device is destroyed or is unavailable, we must go to the server. So we may look at Exchange or Office 365. And in there's going to be a few different things that we're going to want. We're going to, for one, want to know the transaction logs. These are the records of the physical database interactions between every sent and received message. We're going to also want the tracking logs, which are the gold mine. This is going to provide you with all the message routing details, including the sender, the recipient, the time, and the subject. We want those tracking logs. And then lastly, we may want the OWA logs if we're talking about like Outlook Web Access or Outlook 365. And this is going to reveal the IP addresses of the users who are logging in via their web browser. Now, message tracking logs are standard practice in enterprise and investigations because we want to prove that the email was actually delivered to the suspect's inbox, proving they had access to the information. But be aware that, again, those IP addresses that we will find many times can be obfuscated by using things like VPN sources, Tor networks, or anything that is going to proxy the IP address through the internet. But what if the user uses Gmail, Yahoo, Outlook, Hotmail? What if they use any web-based email is what I'm trying to say. In webmail forensics, the evidence is not going to probably be in a PST file. Could be, but most likely is not going to be found there. Most of the time is going to be found in a web browser. Now, we can look in the HTML cache, where we might find fragments of read email stored directly in the browser's disk cache. Other ways we can look at it would be looking at the browsing history to find specific links accessed, like mail.google.com/mail/u/0/ insert number here. Okay. And then we may even extract cookies from memory or disk to allow access to the account without even needing the suspect's passwords. Now, session tokens are getting harder and harder to use, but just be aware that they still could be there. The exam highlights that webmail requires standard browser forensics. Volatility and RAM analysis are going to be critical here because remember, an open Gmail tab will have decrypted email content sitting entirely in RAM. So we might be able to pull the information there. Now that we've talked about email quite a bit, of how to identify what pieces of RAM or what pieces of email do we need, what email pieces should we be looking at to try to help prove our investigation, let's look at a couple tools needed to actually complete some of this work. So for analyzing headers and visualizing the path, we can use tools like Google Admin Toolbox or even the MX Toolbox. MX Toolbox is one of my favorite. We can use tools like PST Viewer to open up PSTs from Outlook and read them. And just be aware that there are tools out there that already do this for you, like Autopsy and Encase can already open up PSTs and read them already. We may need some dedicated tools like Mail Examiner, and this is going to exist specifically for those deep email forensic analysis when we're really tracing that email back, trying to look at DKIM, SPF, and a whole bunch of other fun stuff for that DMARC. And then we're going to use tools like Aid for Mail because this is going to be excellent for converting and migrating during extraction. Aid for Mail is one of those tools that I really like, that if I need to get a copy of an online web-based email server and I can log into that email, I can download the email through Aid for Mail to get a local copy. Now for the exam, memorize the names of some of these commercial tools because they'll probably be in multiple choice questions. They may ask you to identify which tool from a list that specifically is designed for PST repair or for email header analysis. So you may need to know each one of those. Now, we also need to be aware that criminals are going to try to hide their tracks using anti-forensics. Just like anything, if everything was easy, our job would just be that much easier and we wouldn't have to dig so hard. But they're going to use anti-forensics tools to try to hide. Now, anonymous remailers, these are services like Mixmaster, is going to identify headers and strip them. And this is going to allow you to send mail normally anonymously. We have other tools like Proton Mail or Tor, which are encrypted services to purposely not log user IP addresses. That's what they are designed to do. Or they could just use drafts, which is a classic espionage technique where two users share the same password to a single account. One writes a message and saves it to drafts, and the other one logs in and reads it. Because the email is never formally sent, no SMTP logs are ever generated. Now, for the exam, know that the drafts technique is also called a dead drop. Okay, it's a popular exam concept because it bypasses all network level MTA and interception, meaning the investigator must gain access to the webmail provider's internal logs or the suspect's physical devices to prove communication. Email is heavily protected by privacy laws, and we're going to need to operate within the legal framework. So there's a couple different laws that we need to understand. The first one's going to be the ECPA, which is the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. This is going to strictly regulate government access to stored emails. We have the Can Spam Act, which rules that commercial email, it's going to set rules for commercial email and any requirements for commercial email messages. And then lastly, it's going to be the expectation of privacy. Now, this is generally speaking, employees have no expectation of privacy when using corporate email systems. Just be aware there is some papers that have to be signed for this, but normally written in our acceptable use policy or something in that nature, showing that, hey, there is no expectation of privacy while using a corporate system. So you really need to understand ECPA quite a bit, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. And what it really says there's a 180-day rule. Emails stored on the server for less than 180 days require a strict search warrant to obtain, whereas older emails may be obtained with just a subpoena. So there are different rules for different things. And so, as always, that search order, the warrant, is going to be our go-to. All right, we covered a lot here, okay? We covered a lot about email. And email is not my favorite thing to talk about, but it's so highly utilized and used in communication, in corporate and in private worlds. It's just, so you really need to understand it if you want to be great at being an investigator. And we need to know that headers are going to be key to tracing origins. So you're going to look at bottom, most trusted receive field. Remember the bottom up to find the origin. And then we're going to then need to understand that POP and IMAP receives while SMTP sends, and know where the data lives, whether or not it's on the client or the server. We need to know what kind of artifacts we're looking for, PST, OST, inbox, what kind of artifacts are we looking for. And then finally, we need to talk a little bit about security here. We need to know SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, and know that we use this to help identify spoofed emails and the validity of emails that are sent through the internet. Now, email forensics is going to combine things like network forensics, like headers and protocols, with host-based forensics, like PSTs and web artifacts. So to establish a full picture, we need to look at everything. Because in order to have a full scope of our legal authority, we need to be able to extract email data from, well, clients or even servers and prove that we are correct on that. All right, so that's going to be a wrap of our Chapter 11. If there's any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you for Chapter 12 as we go into cloud forensics. Now, ensure that you have a solid grasp on how to trace an IP address through email headers, as this concept will be the foundation for tracing malicious activity in cloud environments as well. I'll see you for cloud.